The call to faith is a summons to engage the heart, to attune it to resonate in sympathy with principles and values and ideals that we devoutly hope are true, and which we have reasonable but not certain grounds for believing to be true. There must be grounds for doubt as well as belief in order to render the choice more truly a choice, and therefore more deliberate and laden with more personal vulnerability and investment. An overwhelming preponderance of evidence on either side would make our choices meaningless as would a loaded gun pointed at our heads. The option to believe must appear on one's personal horizon like the fruit of paradise, perched precariously between sets of demands held in dynamic tension. Fortunately, in this world one is always provided with sufficient materials out of which to fashion a life of credible conviction or dismissive denial. We're acted upon, in other words, by appeals to our personal values, our yearnings, our fears, our appetites, and our egos. What we choose to embrace, to be responsive to, is the purest reflection of who we are and what we love. That is why faith, the choice to believe, is, in the final analysis, an action that is positively laden with moral significance. The call to faith, in this light, is not some test of a coy God waiting to see if we get it right. It is the only summons, issued under the only conditions, which can allow us to reveal fully who we are, what we most love, and what we most devoutly desire. Without constraint, without any form of mental compulsion, the act of belief becomes the freest possible projection of what resides in our hearts. Like the poet's image of a church bell that reveals its latent music only when struck, or a dragonfly that flames forth its beauty only in flight, so does the content of a human heart lie buried until action calls it forth. The greatest act of self-revelation occurs when we choose what we will believe in that space of freedom that exists between knowing that a thing is and knowing that a thing is not. These passages that so deftly and beautifully illustrate the profoundly challenging choice to believe flowed from the pen of today's guest, the inimitable Terryl Givens, in his short essay, Letter to a Doubter. Givens is a career-long academic, scholar, and public intellectual. He did his undergraduate studies at BYU in comparative literature before doing graduate work at Cornell in intellectual history and later earning a Ph.D. in comparative literature at UNC Chapel Hill. As a professor, he taught courses on religion and literature at the University of Richmond for over 30 years before moving to Utah to act as a senior research fellow for the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship. Givens is, as my friend and today's co-host Bronzson says, perhaps the most important LDS thinker of our generation. During his career, he has been incredibly prolific, having published 25 books and counting, dealing with Mormon studies, history, and philosophy, including such titles as By the Hand of Mormon, The God Who Weeps, and The Crucible of Doubt. Givens served a mission to Sao Paulo, Brazil from 1976 to 78, a time he calls pivotal and foundational to the rest of his life. In this episode, we talk about some sources of Givens' academic inspirations, Latter-day Saint theology as, quote, the most intellectually compelling system of theological thought in the Christian world, the importance of recognizing lived Christianity during the mission, and a whole lot more. All this coming up next. You have a beautiful office there.
Yeah, not a bad library.
Not bad at all. All you need is like a book ladder so you can climb up it and feel like you're, oh, you have one? Oh, man, you've got it all. Of course.
The dream is complete.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So you made the move to Utah just a few years ago, right?
That's right.
How's that been for you?
Yeah, trade-offs. Everything in life is trade-offs, right?
Yeah. You miss Virginia?
Yeah, we don't miss the mold and humidity and heat, but we miss the green and the woods.
Oh, yeah.
The natural beauty. Yeah. So who am I talking to? I'm here talking to Sam and
Bronzson.
So Bronzson is a huge fan of yours. They say, don't meet your heroes, and yet here we are introducing Bronzson to his hero.
Uh-oh,
so
bad news.
Yeah.
I got introduced to your work when I was like at a really pivotal point in my life. I had a daughter, my second child, who was born with a intellectual handicap. And it was just a very difficult time religiously. Yeah. And I picked up The Crucible of Doubt, and it had a very big effect on me. So I was very appreciative of it. And then since then, I'm kind of a Givens completist. I haven't read your first Serpent at the Hearth. Is that what it's called? Yeah, or Viper in the Hearth, right? But outside of that, basically the whole corpus.
Well, I got 25 books out there. You've probably missed a few.
Yeah, I'm sure I missed a few. So yeah, it's great to get to talk to you.
So, Terryl, how did you get into your career as an academic from the start?
You mean this particular direction my academic career has taken? Because this certainly wasn't planned.
So what did you think when you were first starting your career, and then give us the unplanned part?
You know, we've got a saying in our family, Givenses just aren't good at working for anybody. So I got 7 siblings and lots of relatives, and most of us tend to be like independent business owners, or, well, that's pretty much what most of us are. And I think I didn't see myself fitting in any way into a corporate world. My dad had pretty strong prejudices against bankers, lawyers, and doctors, so that pretty much ruled those out. And I think the life of the mind always appealed to me. I was always a reader. I was always curious. My dad was a teacher, a lot of teachers in my family background. So I saw this advertisement coming back from my mission. It said, do you like languages? Do you like literature? Try comparative literature. And that sounded like kind of fit the bill. I really loved languages, loved learning Portuguese and books. So I started out in comparative literature, and then I shifted to intellectual history. I love books because there are windows into other worlds, into other minds, into other times and cultures. And so I found myself migrating more to the intellectual history and its spectrum. So I did graduate work at Cornell, did all the coursework in intellectual history. Then I decided I missed literature, and I went back and finished the Ph.D. at Chapel Hill in comparative literature, and got my first job as a literature professor at the University of Richmond in 1988, and expected I'd spend the rest of my life teaching 19th century poetry to a bunch of bored undergraduates. And I did that.
Which wouldn't be an all bad life, right?
That wouldn't be a bad life. No, I always loved the movie Mr. Chips. And the University of Richmond is a beautiful, beautiful campus. And it's all done in this collegiate Gothic architecture, beautiful setting, lake and woods, and really good students. So no, I had a good time, good experience teaching there for a couple of years. And my dad, he owned a bookstore, and he collected anti-Mormon stuff. Not because he was anti-Mormon, he just thought it was kind of fun and interesting and crazy. And there's a lot of crazy 19th century anti-Mormon stuff. And one day he just gave me this box load, and he said, "You're a literature professor. Do something with this stuff." So I thought, okay, I'll write an article on it. And there was a series from Harper's Magazine, 2 Mormons from Muddlety. There were a couple of Zane Grey anti-Mormon novels, Sherlock Holmes anti-Mormon novel, and the series of magazine articles from Cosmopolitan Magazine in 1913 called The Viper on the Hearth. So I started writing this article, and then I realized pretty soon, hey, there's enough for more than an article. So I ended up writing this book, and it was the first book that looked at the problem of anti-Mormonism from a literary rather than a historical lens. And I was trying to answer the question, how come Mormonism elicited so much attention and outrage out of all proportion to its size? And has there been a constant feature in the kind of marginalization of Mormonism in Christian history? And I think all of these hundreds of novels and magazine articles provided a unique window into that question. So anyhow, I published Viper on the Hearth in 1997, and thought I was done with Mormon studies. And then in the year about 1998, 99, I opened a Church News one week, and there was an article, the headline said, Latter-day Saint Church publishes the 100 millionth copy of the Book of Mormon. Man, that's a lot of books. How does that compare to Harry Potter? Actually, I don't think Harry Potter was out yet. But I did a quick bit of research in the library and discovered it's the most widely distributed book in American history, produced by an American. So I fired off a proposal to Oxford, and very quickly I got a response that said effectively, you write the book and we'll publish it. And I remember saying to the senior editor at Oxford, wow, that's great, but I didn't expect you would be willing to do 2 books on Mormonism. And I remember she said, it's the American religion. I think we'll do more than 2 books. And so that was By the Hand of Mormon in 2002. So one more quick story.
Yeah.
This is a long answer to your question.
This is a great answer.
Perfect. Yeah.
So Viper on the Hearth, it did well. It was well reviewed, but it was kind of an academic, very limited audience. By the Hand of Mormon, it got reviewed in the New York Times, got reviewed in Harper's, got reviewed in the London Review. So suddenly it's, Mormonism splashed everywhere. And there were positive reviews. So I remember showing up in my department. My department chair comes in, and I think he's coming to congratulate me for the New York Times review. No, sits down and he says, "What are you going to get back to doing what we hired you to do?"
Whoa.
And I said, "Well, Book of Mormon's a pretty influential
It's the great American religion."
Yeah. And he said, "No, that's not what we hired you for, and I expect you to get back to what your job is." Very hostile, very unpleasant exchange. He left. In walks the dean of the college. And he's waving a copy of the New York Times. And he's going, "This is great. We're hearing from our donors and alumni. And can you sign a copy for one of our donors?"
Wow.
So I signed the book. And then he says, "Can I do anything for you?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, you can." And I told him about what had just transpired. And he said, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And I said, "Can I have a new job title?" And he said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Professor of Religion and Literature."
Wow.
And he said, "You'll have it this afternoon."
Oh my goodness.
And I got a new contract that afternoon. And so that changed the whole trajectory of my career, because it gave me cover and it gave me some credibility, because I had done 2 books on religious studies. And so I was free the rest of my career to go in that direction. And it turned out that this was kind of on the threshold of Mormon studies kind of becoming a thing. And so I really enjoyed writing about Latter-day Saints for an academic audience.
Mm-hmm.
And then around about 2012, my wife and I migrated into writing devotional books as well for a Latter-day Saint audience. So that's the story of my career.
Your wife, by the way, I've just been listening to All Things New. She has such a beautiful, pleasant voice. You're a lucky man.
Yeah, that's what I fell in love with first.
Yeah, it's great. So you're very, intelligent, intellectual, and articulate. What are some of the authors or some of the books that you have read and found the most inspiration from in your life, whether inside the LDS corpus or outside, if that's philosophers, fiction, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, I just point to a couple of highlights.
Yeah.
The most formative book that I read when I was really making a deep dive into intellectual history was a book by Arthur Lovejoy called The Great Chain of Being. And it's just this monumental history of an idea, the great chain of being, which is kind of this conceptual paradigm by which we understand the universe that really was the dominant metaphor for the cosmos from Greek antiquity all the way up to the 18th century. And just the idea that you could track an idea through centuries and do it across languages and cultures, and I was so impressed. I thought it was such a phenomenal piece of scholarship. I think that's what converted me to intellectual history, or the history of ideas as a discipline. As an undergraduate, I remember reading Gadamer, Hans-Georg Gadamer, a German philosopher. And there were just a couple of ideas in this early 20th century philosopher that powerfully influenced me. One was this idea of what he called the genuine question. And he said, a genuine question is a question that exposes you to risk, because it's a question that you ask with sincerity, willing to stake your all on the answer. And so I think it was that idea that in some ways kind of gave me the intellectual and spiritual courage to write the book on the Book of Mormon, where I said, okay, I'm going to try to read every single anti-Mormon tract and book that has been written up through 1980s, 90s, which you could almost do back then. And then his other idea was that he tried to validate prejudice, not in the sense of discriminatory or racist predispositions, but prejudice as a place of orientation that we begin with. And he said, it's ridiculous to think that we can ever approach a question or a topic from a disinterested, objective point of view. And so what we need to do is to make our prejudice a point of departure and be willing to engage a response and a correction to that prejudice. And so what I took that to mean in the work that I started to do very quickly in Latter-day Saint intellectual history, was see my faith orientation as an advantage and not a disadvantage.
Mm-hmm.
Because it represented a set of values and propositions that I believed were true, but that I thought could and needed to withstand scrutiny and interrogation. And so that, I think, principle has kind of guided me ever since. I don't think that our faith and testimony should predispose our answers in the intellectual sphere, but I think it's perfectly legitimate for them to shape our questions. And so I have tried in my own work to address questions that are of great moment to me because of my faith commitments, and it's worked out well. And in terms within the faith tradition, I think probably the two most influential voices in my early life were the sermons and talks of Neal Maxwell, because I thought he represented a genuine lover. He was a genuine lover of the humanities. And don't see that all too often. General authorities who are really committed to art and music and literature. Yeah. President Kimball, I think, was as well. And then Jane England. Later, when I came across Jane England, who I think I held at some distance for a number of years because I thought he was a little bit too edgy, pushed the boundaries of intellectual and religious propriety a little bit too far for my taste initially. But he became increasingly, I think, important to me as a model mm-hmm. of a kind of wrestling discipleship. So those would be the few names I think of.
So speaking of Eugene England, I think he had a lot of courage. He was like a very public figure, right? Yeah. And like you said, he really pushed the boundaries in a lot of areas. You're a very public intellectual in the church. And it seems to me that you have kind of this interesting insider-outsider status where you're trusted by the membership, you're carried by Deseret Book, the Maxwell Institute, et cetera, while at the same time, you're not kind of afraid to question the received wisdom, these cultural traditions. I think in All Things New, for example, you push sometimes gently against these traditions that exist in the culture. How do you balance that kind of insider-outsider status?
I don't think I could have become the scholar I am if I had grown up in Utah or taught at BYU. My intellectual circle for many years at the University of Richmond consisted of a devout Catholic, a born-again evangelical, a secular Jew who converted to serious Judaism, and a Presbyterian minister who converted to Buddhism.
It sounds like the beginning of a joke, Terryl.
We all walk into this. So all of my conversations, right, took place in the context of this radical religious diversity. And I couldn't take anything for granted. I couldn't use a peculiar vocabulary or set of presumptions. And so it's like everything that I was writing in those early years was written with that kind of an audience in mind. And with my experience having been talking to those people and seeing the world through those diverse lenses. So, yeah, it's nice that you say what you do about my audience and reception. It hasn't been all as uniformly smooth sailing as you indicate. And the church, the institutional church, has gone through periodic pendulum swings. There was a time, I think two golden ages of intellectual adventuresomeness were, Joseph Smith's years, the years of Joseph and Parley Pratt and Orson Pratt. And it really was a kind of intellectual adventuresomeness. And then that kind of fades. Wilford Woodruff said, theology is the greatest tomfoolery in all the world. That didn't help. And then there's this effervescence in the 1930s when 3 of the quorum have Ph.D.s, which isn't a sign of higher qualification, but it's certainly a sign that the church valued higher education. And they were writing the manuals and leading out in kind of assimilating and integrating the best learning of that period in our own cultural history. And then there's a period of terrible retrenchment and retraction in the 1970s and 80s. And then the church historical department kind of leads the way toward this intellectual revolution where suddenly there's this recognition that, no, we have to do a better job of telling our history according to academic standards. And we published the Joseph Smith papers and a new version of the church history and the gospel topics pages. And led by Marlon Jensen at the church history department and President Hinckley, who was really so enthusiastic about church history. That was a great time to be a Latter-day Saint historian. Now we've entered a more cautionary period again. And so there isn't quite that spirit of openness and inquiry and intellectual adventuresomeness that I thrive in. So we'll see how things unfold over the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's I think a very interesting analysis. One of the things that I noticed, and I guess this isn't a question, but I think there are scholars that are strictly apologetic, right? And then there are also Latter-day Saint scholars who write for an academic audience who try, I think, maybe overcorrect in the other direction. They saw Rough Stone Rolling get kind of panned as being too pro-Mormon and then went so hard. But one thing that I've appreciated about you is that you kind of wear it on your sleeve while doing high quality academic work. You're not afraid of your faith commitments.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. That means a lot because I have pretty strong feelings in this regard. So I think when one even uses the word apologetics, one needs to triangulate with regard to a couple of kind of ground rules and historical precedents. One is that apologetics has a very noble and worthy past in early Christian history, where the first Christian intellectuals devoted themselves to making a defense of Christianity according to standards of classical philosophy and rationality. And I think that's a worthy endeavor. I think apologetics in our own tradition hit a number of low periods in which a different kind of apologetics sometimes was practiced that could be aggressive and confrontational and didn't rely on the best scholarship in order to try to make arguments. I don't think I've ever used that word in reference to myself. Nate Oman once wrote a really lovely review of one of my books, and he called me a gospel celebrant. And I like that. I like that definition. So if I'm an apologist, I guess I would like to think of myself as a proactive rather than reactive apologist, insofar as I've been highly motivated. And I think my work has tried to be true to a point first made by Sterling McMurn when he wrote this lovely little book on the philosophical foundations of Mormonism. And according to his story, he was a professor at University of Utah. He was Kennedy's Commissioner of Education, I think was his title. And he was an inactive Latter-day Saint. But he had a colleague who came to him afterwards and said, "Sterling, you make Mormonism sound so much more intellectually respectable than it is." And he said, "Yeah, that's because most Latter-day Saints think it's so much less intellectually respectable than it is." And so, as an intellectual historian, I'm convinced. I think Latter-day Saint theology is the most intellectually compelling system of theological thought in the Christian world. And so I don't have to strain or stretch the evidence to make that argument. I think, look, I don't want to quote inaccurately, but just Friday night, I hosted the Jewish atheist intellectual Jonathan Rauch in a public conversation. And he asked me to present a Latter-day Saint version of theodicy. And as a Jewish intellectual, looking back at the history of the Holocaust, he finds Christian theodicy appalling in the way it just kind of absolves God of any kind of real moral responsibility to conform or to embody the moral values that we feel we are accountable to. And so I spent 5 or 10 minutes trying to frame the beginnings of a Mormon theodicy. And at the end, he said something to the effect of, "You've converted me, I'm a Mormon." Now, clearly, there was overstatement and half joking. But it was also clear to me that he thought he was recognizing an approach to the problem of evil, the problem of agency, that he hadn't found expressed with such intellectual credibility as the way, I was presenting Latter-day Saint thought to him. So I do think that we have intellectual resources that we have not plumbed and we have not fully exploited, and that's part of what I'm trying to do.
You do such a great job of it. I mean, the way that you lay out your ideas, it just makes things so clear. And so the more that you and people like you make the message that, hey, what we believe is very logical and it's very consistent, and I think that's a great thing that you do.
Thank you.
Yeah, like letting the intellectually inclined members of the church have role models who you can say, "Oh, this guy's very smart and He seems like he's got a lot of integrity and he believes this. Like,
Well,
it's nice to have those role models.
Yeah.
It's very nice.
well, I had a very bizarre priesthood class just this past week where I'm sitting in the back row and haven't opened my mouth, but the whole priesthood lesson became a kind of debate about whether my Sunday school classes are appropriate. And they called me out by name and said, some of them were saying, I think the gospel, if we can't make it understandable to a 5-year-old, we're doing something wrong. To which my response inside, I didn't express it, but was, I think Heavenly Father's probably progressed beyond a 5th grade education. But, we mistake the principle of gospel simplicity for the principle of gospel richness and intellectual appetite. And I just felt many of them had a very impoverished understanding of salvation. If you say, well, all you need to know is Jesus, and that's all you need to know for well, how are you defining salvation? Because I thought we defined salvation as acquiring the divine nature, becoming like God. And that means that we have to go a little bit beyond 5-year-old explanations of the gospel. So there's a large constituency in the church who, that's what they want. And there are others who think we don't need intellectuals, we don't need theology. And there's room for both, maybe in the church, but nobody can speak to both audiences.
Yeah, and also I think betrays like a kind of ignorance of our history, right? Joseph,
Slightly.
to Brigham, they were not
School of the Prophets, University of Nauvoo, Joseph Smith's personal library. We could go on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They didn't stop at just the 5-point plan, is what you're saying, Bronzson.
Yeah, no one loved the mysteries more than Joseph and Brigham.
Yeah. And I understand the point, right? I'm not gonna be asking questions gospel doctrine about, did God have a father who was a God who had it? No. But come on, little intellectual curiosity is not a bad thing.
So regarding your mission, you said years ago during the PBS interview, maybe over 20 years ago, you said, quote, "Those 2 years really were a pivotal time in my life. I think most Latter-day Saints who served missions refer to those years as a kind of rite of passage and in many ways foundational to the rest of their lives. That certainly was the case for me. So for you, why was this time so pivotal and what foundation did it build?"
Well, I came to the church fairly late. My family was baptized when I was 8 or 9, but we fell into inactivity within a few years. And so I didn't have the gospel in those formative early teen years. Rediscovered the church when I was 16, going on 17, and I just took to it like a duck to water. I did yard work for widows in the neighborhood for pay, and every penny went to buy books. And I just read everything I could, history of the church, Hugh Nibley. Some authors probably didn't always deserve to be read that were marketed by Bookcraft and Deseret, but I was mission bound, and I looked forward to that. Never for a moment considered not going on a mission in those next couple of years. So I was ready psychologically, and I think spiritually, to make that commitment. I was fortunate enough to be sent to a place, Brazil, where there was an abundance of people who were willing to listen, prepared to listen. So it wasn't like my poor son who went to Hungary and never got into a home in 2 years.
Yeah.
And so it was rich and rewarding that way. But I also just, I look back and I still can't believe the quality of the men and women that I served with, the spiritual maturity and strength. And part of it, I think, is we're such a tiny mission. We couldn't get visas. And by the time I got there, I think there were fewer than 60 missionaries in the mission. So we were very close, very tight-knit. And I just felt like I was serving with these green berets that were just years ahead of their time, spiritually and emotionally and developmentally. And so I had a rich 2-year experience, immersed in the scriptures, immersed in the reality of lived Christianity and its transformative power in the lives of these converts that were coming in abundant numbers. Yeah, it was foundational. In anticipation of this interview, I was trying to recreate in my mind some of the feelings that I experienced, a level of spiritual intensity and confidence that in many ways you never really recapture, right? Yeah. You can't go back to that kind of first innocence before you saw that there's also a lot of complexity and problematic challenges that one does have to work through in one's life in the church. But it was a time really of spiritual abundance.
Yeah, it's amazing what an intense experience that can be when you're out there and you're really just immersed in it. Did you find that your mission changed your relationship with the doctrine or with the church, or recontextualized anything specifically for you as you were out there teaching and learning?
I don't remember going through any kinds of developmental leaps. It just felt like a kind of natural process coming at the right time that segued beautifully into coming back. And within 2 years, I'm married, starting a family. And no, I remember just loving my mission and loving the experience. And I think realizing I'll never again be able to live the gospel so intensely without distraction. And so I think that was something that I cherished at the time.
I agree with that. The mission being time-bound makes you suck the marrow out of it, right? Because you know it's going to end, whereas the rest of life, you don't tend to appreciate it as much because it's a marathon, right? Yeah. Do you feel like, besides coming home and having learned Portuguese and learning that you had a love for languages, do you feel like your mission in any way helped prepare you for your career, being an academic and an author?
Yeah, I think so. Not every missionary is comfortable in a teaching situation. And I think it affirms me in a kind of confidence, level of comfort doing expository speaking and teaching. I'm an introvert, always been an introvert, still an introvert. Turns out that an unusually high percentage of teachers are introverts.
Yeah.
And so I think I kind of learned that paradox there, that I'm not great in group settings, but give me a subject to try to share or transmit to somebody, and I tried. So that was good for that reason too.
In the Doors of Faith, you talk about a sacrifice that your mother made for you during your mission. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it impacted you?
Yeah, neither my father nor my mother were great communicators. My dad didn't interact with us very much. We didn't have a really open, comfortable, affectionate kind of relationship with our mom and dad. They were both kind of emotionally isolated and distant. And one of the consequences of that was that at no point, any time before my mission, did we talk about who's going to pay for this. And so I saved from the time I was 16 and was able to cover, I guess, maybe the first half, still not knowing exactly where's the balance going to come from. And halfway through, the checks just continued to come. And I didn't know until afterwards. My father was a school teacher. He just didn't make sufficient. He had 8 kids. There was no way he could cover it. And my mother took a job as the church custodian. And so I learned that there's my mom going into the church, cleaning bathrooms and emptying trash cans, and never said a word to me about it. And just the money kept coming. And so that was certainly a beautiful experience of deep my love and appreciation for this mother who never had to even feel that I recognized the sacrifice she was making, just lovingly made it.
You also talk on, I think it might have been the PBS interview as well, about what you felt was a miracle during your mission, which was the removal of the ban on blacks in the priesthood coming about when you were in the field. Would you mind telling us about that again?
Yeah, it was a very sacred experience and miraculous to me as I experienced it. You know, we had the terrible burden in Brazil in the 1970s of not being permitted to teach people of color unless they sought us out. And that was church-wide and especially emphasized in Brazil, in which racial intermarriage is extremely common, much more prevalent than in the United States. And it wasn't until the last weeks of my mission that a man of color came to the chapel, specifically said, I want to be taught. And so, of course, we were happy to teach him, given that license to do so. And his wife was very hostile initially, but she started eavesdropping and then sitting in for the discussions. And pretty soon it was clear that both of them were just fully ready and anxious to make these covenants and join the church. They had 2 or 3 children. And so I dreaded the day that I knew was coming in the next weeks when we would have to teach them what was called the doctrine of the lineage. And I had a brand new companion, and the baptism was scheduled. They still knew nothing about this priesthood then. They were talking about going to the temple, the kids going to the temple and being sealed. And that was just excruciating for me. And so we went before the baptism to teach them this assigned lesson. And I taught it many, many, many times before, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And we went with that in mind. And when the time came, I just couldn't. I just visited with them a bit and shut my flip chart and said, we'll see you at the baptism. And as we left, my companion was just highly agitated. He's a missionary. He knows the rules. He goes, what are you doing? You know we have to teach that. And I said, I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. And as we're walking home to our apartment, we pass the zone leader's home. And he comes running out saying, have you heard the revelation? Have you heard the revelation? And the word had just come through from President Kimball that all people were now eligible for the priesthood. And so they were baptized. And he was immediately eligible. And so it's a beautiful end to a story that was fraught with anxiety and hurt. We raced inside when the zone leader told us that. And members were just flooding. And then we went from there to the stake president's home, which is nearby. The members just pouring in, weeping, embracing, just sobbing for joy. There was no land where there was more rejoicing than Brazil.
I'm sure. You also shared once about how your faith changed after you had been caught in a rip current. I know I'm going back into the vault here, but...
Yeah, you are.
But I read it and I thought it was really interesting how your conclusion from that experience, I thought, relates to missions. I'm curious if you remember that story, if you could give the brief summary of it, and then we'll tie it into missions.
Yeah. Well, it was in about the year, gosh, I don't even remember now, around the year, just before 2000, I think. And I was on a faculty trip abroad, and a colleague had gotten swept out in a riptide, swimming where she wasn't supposed to be swimming. It was prohibited and dangerous beach. And so I saw what was happening, and I'm not a great swimmer, but the situation seemed to admit of no alternative other than jumping in and trying to swim out. It was clear she was in distress. She'd been out there for a long time, couldn't make her way back through the currents. And so I didn't swim out to her as much as I was just swept up by this riptide, and found immediately that I was not capable of swimming back through the current, let alone dragging her back with me. And so she realized we were drowning and expressed that sentiment, which wasn't tremendously helpful at the time. But we both realized that there was no rescue in sight and we were drowning. And so I had a near-death, I guess I'd call it a near-death experience, because I didn't go through any tunnel. But I did not experience the kind of ensign happy story where you feel comfort or angelic assistance or anything else. I feel like I experienced the precipice of the void. And then by coincidence or miracle, take your pick, we were swept over a sandbar. And suddenly the ground was 7 or 8 feet below us, and we found we could push off against current. So we made our way most of the way back, then I collapsed. And the doctor said shock and semi-consciousness, and they dragged me out. And so made it to be here, but when I got there, I realized, man, I didn't feel God, I didn't feel angels, I didn't feel the immortality of the soul. Suddenly I realized I don't know anything that I thought I knew. And so that was, I guess, my own variety of a very traumatic loss of faith and kind of recognition that I didn't any longer have the kind of certainty, confidence that I had when I went into that water. And so, to make the long story shorter, I began from that moment in my life to have to work in a very deliberate, self-aware, self-conscious process of introspection and kind of the rebuilding of a life of faith. And so whereas before it had just come naturally to a 16-year-old kid going to church and reading books and praying, now I had to begin from scratch. And it was a different kind of process. But I reconstituted and rediscovered faith through a very different kind of series of steps than I'd been through the first time.
Yeah. And one thing that was part of your reconstituting of faith was basically, you mentioned earlier, lived Christianity. You said of seeing, let's see your exact words. You said, it strikes me that the most important principles, doctrines, teachings are not what really founds one's faith, but rather the way that one sees the evidence of God in other people, in their countenances, in the way they treat each other. The evidences that I find for God are what I would call the fruits of the gospel more than the teachings. It's maybe more sensitive to the ways in which I have been able to see that the things that I have always espoused, things that I have always believed and taught, do in fact bring real peace, real happiness, real serenity into the lives of people. The reason that hit me is, to me, that was completely the experience of my mission and is the primary part of my testimony too. And to have 2 years straight of seeing people living out the gospel and seeing that effect was such an incredible experience. And I think that probably was true for you as well.
Well, yeah, I think the poem that was most pivotal in my reconstituting of faith was a poem by the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. Beautiful poem, but it ends, "For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces." A little bit difficult syntax there in Hopkins, but what he's saying is Christ is manifest in the faces of those whose life he has infused. And there's no such thing as a self-validating foundation, right? You can't say, well, I'll prove it by logic, because you already have to have confidence in logic. Ditto science, ditto anything else. So you have to choose some non-negotiable foundation and just say, this is where I start. And I think my non-negotiable foundation, I think from that point on, was the letter of Paul to the Galatians, when he said the fruits of the Spirit are peace, joy, love. And so I thought, no matter how you assess the validity of my commitments from any outside source, I feel secure and I'm willing to risk my life in pursuit of what I know is peace, joy, and love as I experience those things. And that's what I became increasingly sensitized to see in the lives of those who lived the gospel and lived the precepts that I had taught and believed for so long.
I think that one of the great experiences of being on a mission is getting to see, oftentimes you're coming from I came from a very sheltered background. I grew up in middle-class Utah, where my biggest problems were not very big.
Yeah.
And living life and living the gospel all came very naturally and very easily. And then you are thrust into an alien world where the stakes are so high and the people are so real, and you see the actual effects of the gospel as the stone is rolling down the hill, right?
That's right. Yep. That was certainly true in Brazil, a land of extensive deprivation and hardship and poverty and challenges. So the gospel's fruits there are readily discernible.
Last question for you, Terryl. What advice would you give to somebody considering or currently preparing for a mission?
I guess the same advice that I think is relevant to anybody making any decision about a course of action, which is to consider, okay, 2 years, you're going to be 2 years older. Is it likely that you're going to be happy that you spent the last 2 years serving Christ? Or are you going to be happier being 2 years older, but without that experience? It seems to me the answer would be pretty self-evident if you ask that question.
I love it. Thank you so much. Man, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience for us to get a talk with you. I know Bronzson's been geeking out the whole time, so.
Yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time, and it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. Good to talk with you both.
Okay, that's it for the podcast. Man, pretty cool, huh? Thanks again to Terryl Givens for sharing his time, wisdom, deep thoughts. Thanks to Bronzsson for jumping on for the conversation. And We'll be back in future weeks. My episodes are a little sporadic, but they'll come out when they come out. So look for them on Wednesdays. Anyway, thanks a lot. Bye.